For the last 3 weeks, I've brought you individuals who've made a significant contribution to Black history. Most of those individuals that we've discussed have been in and around the civil rights movement or have lived through the civil rights movement. And it's only natural to focus on the civil rights movement because it's very close to us. Many of our parents and grandparents and aunts and uncles lived through the 60s and the 50s, and we have a connection there. But history is very important. History just isn't something that's in our lifetime. We have just but a small portion of history. We have to go back even further. And so that's what today is going to be about. The civil rights movement, while it was great, while we had a lot of great leaders there, but the leaders of the civil rights movement stood on the shoulders of other leaders. That line can be drawn back to the 20s. But today I'd like to take that line back a little bit further to before the Civil War. I'd like to talk about today the Compromise of 1850. Now, before I get into it, I just want to talk a little bit about history. I love history. I've loved history ever since I can remember. Some of my best days as a child was not watching cartoons, but watching documentaries. And that's something that I still do to this day. So that's why this really has a resonance for me. Okay, the Compromise of 1850. If you take a look at American history, our history has really revolved around compromises. From the very beginning, there was the Three-Fifths Compromise. And there's a long list of compromises all the way to the 1850 Compromise. And if you think about it, a lot of those compromises had to do with slavery. And this is nothing different. The Compromise of 1850 was about slavery, pure and simple. And here are some of the main points of the Compromise of 1850. So first and foremost, it permitted slavery in Washington, D.C., but it outlawed the slave trade. It added California to the Union as a free state, and it established Utah and New Mexico as territories, not states, but those territories could figure out whether or not they wanted to be free or slave state. There were a couple of other things in there about boundaries with Texas and some monies being paid back, but the accelerant to the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, if you go back in history, this isn't the first Fugitive Slave Act that was passed in this country. The original Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1793. And basically what that did, it told citizens that local governments could go after slaves that had escaped. So if you were a slave, you were in a slave state, but you figured out how to escape to freedom, it was up to the local government to really deal with that situation. However, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 compelled all citizens to assist in the capture of slaves. And it denied those same slaves the right to a trial by jury. It placed control of those cases in the hands of federal commissioners who were paid more for bringing back fugitive slaves. You can only imagine what this did to the abolitionist movement and those who were really supporting the cause of freedom. The records show that the people that escaped through the Underground Railroad increased after the passage of this bill. The Compromise of 1850 had the opposite effect on slavery. The abolitionist movement got fuel from this, and they began to work harder. Now, if we take a step back, what's going on in the country at the time? So it's 1850. The country is not fully formed as you would think of it today. So if you look at a map of the United States of America today, you can see it from the East Coast, across the heartland, to California. Those things were being settled at this time. There's a gold rush happening in California at this time. states are coming into the Union. A lot of the states that we know now, the Dakotas, Utah, New Mexico, those are all territories. The boundaries of the states are being made, and hanging over all of this is the cloud of slavery. Slavery has had an incredible effect on the politics, the early politics of this country until 1865. And so what you're dealing with now is you're looking at politicians on Capitol Hill trying to figure out how not to take the country to war. As we know, with the benefit of hindsight, in 10 years, the country would actually go to war. But even after this, there would be other compromises. There would be the Kansas-Nebraska Act and other things to really try to stop the country from going to war. But for the purposes of our discussion today, I thought that it would be important to talk a little bit about the Compromise of 1850. You know, my goal this entire month has been to share with you things in history that perhaps you haven't heard of, or if you had heard of them, it perhaps sparked something in you to learn a little bit more. I hope these sessions have done that, and I really hope it helps you figure out where we are in history compared to where we were in the past, and I hope it really begins an appetite for learning. Well, thank you all for joining me. I really appreciate it. And remember, Black history is American history. It's just not for the 28 or 29 days in February. It's 365. Thank you for joining me.